So this is our fifth and final lecture, unfortunately. And what we're going to focus on today primarily is proteins, protein-rich foods. So we've talked about sugars, we've talked about fats, and today this last important component. So it's hard to find anything that's really pure protein. Some kinds of fish are probably 70, 80% proteins, in some parts of chicken, but of course they've got a fat in them and other components as well. Beans are a good source of protein, some kinds of nuts, etc. Eggs have a lot of protein in them. So from a biochemical point of view, when you're eating proteins, you're basically getting amino acids. And so this is the structure of an amino acid down here. So it's called this because this NH, that is the amino group, and this COOH on this end, this proton can come off, and that's what acid is. It's just H pluses. So this is an acid group, and there's a carbon that attaches the acid and the amino group, and then there are other molecules, other atoms rather, that can be attached, and there are 20 different kinds. We're going to go into that a little bit. But before we do that, it's different from sugars or fat because it has this nitrogen in it. There are in fact lots of important molecules in our food, in our body, that contain nitrogen. So in addition to the amino groups, here in amino acids, in the nucleotides, these are the somewhat complex molecules that make up our DNA, our RNA. We talked about ATP as the energy source in our body. That is a nucleotide. A core part of that are these nitrogenous bases. You see 4 nitrogens here. And there are a number of other molecules. So the point is that in addition to the oxygen, the carbon, and the hydrogen, we need a lot of nitrogen in our food, or important parts of our body. So if we look at where the nitrogen comes from in the world and in our food, it's different from the other principal components because you can get hydrogen and oxygen, water from the atmosphere. You can get oxygen from the atmosphere. You can get the carbon from the atmosphere, and all of our carbon ultimately comes from solar power. The sun shining on green plants converts this CO2 into sugars and then out into all the other kinds of molecules. But nitrogen is different because nitrogen has to be supplied to the plant. The plant even cannot use the nitrogen that it is swimming in because air is 80% nitrogen gas. All of us are sitting in just a sea of nitrogen right now, but few organisms can use it. In fact, nothing more advanced than a few bacteria are able to actually use the nitrogen that is in the air. And why is it different? It's a very simple chemical difference, and that is that whereas carbon, hydrogen, oxygen is held together when different atoms are put together by 1 or 2 bonds, nitrogen is put together by 3 bonds. So it's a triple bonded molecule, and it forms this into gas. Now we've said that these atoms tried to get 8 electrons around each atom, and so they share a pair here. So this is 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 around this nitrogen. This one is sharing it, 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 around this nitrogen. So nitrogen gas, just because of its electron structure, forms this triple bond. And because it's a triple bond, it's a very hard bond to break. It's very hard to pull these apart. Now, that means that we need some way to fix nitrogen into some accessible form. So this term, nitrogen fixation, used in biochemistry, refers to the fact that nitrogen gas, N2, has to be converted in some way where it combines either with hydrogens to make something like ammonia, or combines with oxygen to make nitrates. And there are various kinds, combinations of nitrogen and oxygen. But these are the two principal forms. And these are the two principal ways that you get nitrogen as fertilizer. This is what plants take up to make amino acids and all of the other nitrogen-containing molecules. So how does that happen? Well, the nitrogen in our food, almost all of it comes from these two types of reactions. So it takes a lot of energy, and one way you can do it is you can industrially make these fixed forms of nitrogen. So this is worked out just before World War II, and after 1945, this became a widely used process where you could take nitrogen gas from the air, combine it with hydrogen. This is often obtained from something like natural gas. And if you use certain catalysts like iron, this ruthenium, aluminum, etc., at very high temperatures and very high atmospheric pressure, you could basically kind of force the hydrogen to combine with the nitrogen, and you can get ammonia. Now, how did we get nitrogen in our food before 1945? And of course, it was done by bacteria. They have an enzyme. These are called nitrogenases. And they do this following very complex reaction. They take nitrogen gas and they add to it 8 electrons that they get from, ultimately some sugar source, and 8 protons, and you end up with a pair of ammonia molecules plus some leftover hydrogen. When you make this ammonia, you generate as a side product hydrogen gas, interestingly. And you do it by using the energy in the food supply, the food that the bacteria are eating, and they convert that food just like us into ATP, and they use the energy in ATP to drive this whole reaction. And just to take one molecule of N2 and convert it to ammonia, it takes 16 ATPs. So this is a really high energy process. And in a way, it's not surprising that it occurs so rarely in nature. Before I move on to the next step, I just want to mention that there is another way that you can get it. Is there some way that you could get a huge amount of energy to combine these molecules? And the answer is thunderstorms. So if you have a real severe lightning storm, those bolts of lightning are terrifically hot, terrifically high energy. Those bolts are going through 80% nitrogen and water vapor, and you get some combination of the hydrogen from the water and the nitrogens. And so you actually make tons and tons of a fertilizer, basically, in a severe electrical storm. Now, in California, we would be in tough shape. We didn't have these nitrogenase enzymes in some organisms because we see so little lightning in California. And it's not a very significant source worldwide, but it is a source. Okay, so just to look a little bit at how we get the nitrogen that we have in our food. So the biological nitrogen fixation occurs in just a certain subset of plants, bean plants mostly, legumes. And in the legumes, on the roots, there are these little nodules. I'm going to show you a picture. They form when the roots get infected with a particular type of bacteria, and then this nitrogenous enzyme can catalyze this reaction. In the Haber process, you take nitrogen, hydrogen gas, put it in at the catalyst in a tank that you can put at very high pressure, very high temperature, and you can produce ammonia. So let's look at this process here, the biological one. So most bacteria are, not bacteria, most nitrogen is fixed, that is combined with hydrogen by bacteria that are inside the nodules on the roots of legumes. So you see them here. Of course, maybe the most important in terms of our food are soybeans. Soybeans are a legume. They have these nodules. They can use nitrogen from the air and produce ammonia, which the plant can then take up and make all kinds of other molecules like nucleotides and amino acids. Now, if you take one of these nodules, and they're about a little bit smaller than a pea typically, and you slice it open, it looks like they have blood inside. And in fact, the red in our blood is from hemoglobin, and the red inside these nodules is called leg hemoglobin. It's a closely related molecule. The hemoglobin in our blood binds oxygen and carries it throughout our body. But this form of hemoglobin in these nodules binds oxygen to keep oxygen from building up to any significant level in the water inside this nodule, because nitrogen fixation requires an oxygen-free space. I've been emphasizing the fact that oxygen has a real high affinity for electrons. And if you are transferring electrons to a nitrogen atom, and if there are any oxygen atoms around, the oxygen atoms will grab the electrons basically, and you won't be able to make nitrogen. So another reason why this is a rare process in nature is that it has to occur anaerobically, and that's the function of these nodules. They have a special layer around them that limits this flow of oxygen into the interior, and then the little bit of oxygen that does get in there is bound by this leg hemoglobin, and then the nitrogenase enzymes in here can take the nitrogen, which will diffuse into the interior here and combine it with hydrogen to make something like ammonia. All right, so let's go forward here. So what we saw is at the beginning of 1900, all the food in the world came from nitrogenase, or a little bit from thunderstorms. There was no synthetic form of nitrogen available to fertilize plants. But after World War II, it started to become available. And where we stand today is that the best estimates are that about half of all the food in the world comes from this synthetically made, this synthetically fixed nitrogen, so synthetic fertilizer. So lots of grazing animals, grazing on plants, you know, out in the fertilizer or out in the field. Plants that are fed on manure and recycled compounds, plants that could be fed by the residues of nitrogen fixing plants like beans. Those don't need synthetic fertilizers, but in order to really meet the current world food demand, 50% of it currently comes from this Haber-Bosch fixed nitrogen. All right, so let me open this up for a few questions at this point before we go into the next part. Maybe if you use your raised hand feature over on the participants panel, and I'll call on you. Anybody? Okay, so Jenna, you're unmuted. Go ahead. Or it's going to be Mark.
I had a question about quinoa. Quinoa has a nice blend of amino acids. Does it have the same kinds of nodules on the roots? Or do you know?
I don't know. I'm predicting that it's not a nitrogen fixer, but I don't know that. It's not a legume, so it's likely that it is not, but I don't know that for a fact. Somebody out there is looking it up on their iPhone. You could probably look it up. Okay, I got a question from Joanne. I'm gonna unmute her. Joanne?
I just wanted to answer Brian on that last question. if you open up the nodule, if there is one on quinoa, if it's white, it's not red. It's not doing anything, so it probably is not a nitrogen fixing nodule, and it's not a legume. So I mean, that's one way to check. Just wanted to mention. But my hand was raised initially. I wanted to ask you, Barry, once a legume is harvested, be it alfalfa, be it beans, whatever, do we have an estimate of how much remains in the soil for the following crop, be it maize, corn, or whatever crop that follows? Is it significant?
It can be, and of course there is this whole concept of talking about green manure, which means you grow a cover crop that is a nitrogen producer. For often in many parts of the world in the past, you would alternate alfalfa, which can fix nitrogen, with corn, and then you'd plow in the alfalfa. It will work, but it's somewhat limited. I've always been interested in this, and there's a good site at the Washington State University where this guy up there has been really doing the quantitation on how much cover crop you have to grow in order to do it. And it's essentially you have to use one whole legume fixing cover crop to provide the nitrogen for something like one wheat crop.
So 1 for 1.
Yeah, and if you get really high yields, you've got to put some additional nitrogen on there from either from manure or from a synthetic fertilizer. Yeah.
Thanks, Barry.
Other questions?
I have a question, and I don't know how to. I'm not finding the raise your hand feature today.
Yeah.
But anyway, with these nodules, then does the NH3 does it leach out of the nodule? Is there an active pump in the nodule that takes it? How does it get out of the nodule?
So there are specific transporters that transport it from the bacteria into the nodule itself. Interestingly, is made of cells manufactured by the plant, and then the bacteria live in the middle of that. Now, some molecules, some forms of ammonia, actually, depending on the pH, can cross biological membranes without a transporter. But then once they get into this fluid that's in contact with the plant cells, there are very specific transporters to really scavenge and take up all of this fixed nitrogen from the soil and from the nodule. And the nodules, what they get from it is the plants are feeding a sugar source to the bacteria. So the plants provide the energy in exchange for the nitrogen.
So when I harvest my fava beans and I see those nodules, I've been knocking the nodules back into the soil. It seems like a good idea. It probably is then. I mean, there might be some in there anyway.
Well, and you want the bacteria there in the soil, because when the bean plant first germinates, there's no bacteria associated with the seed. It's got to get it from an infection, a beneficial infection from bacteria in the soil.
Thank you.
Okay. Other question? Joanne.
I in some instances, the specific bacteria specific to the plant is missing, and I believe you have to get that bacteria and put it into the soil. It's not like any bacteria will make a nodule on any legume. It's a very specific relationship.
That's right. They're just a limited number of bacteria that can grow in these anaerobic conditions that can do this nitrogen fixation process. I think you're right. You often have to inoculate it somehow. Yeah. Constantine, are you unmuted? I'm trying to unmute you. No, not yet. Unmute. Okay, go ahead.
So is that what we do when we create the mulch, parts in our garden and stuff, have the bacteria for us to create the nitrogen?
Well, so the nitrogen fixing can only be done by certain plants, mostly legumes, bean plants. what the advantage of just mulching is that it provides a lot of carbon-based material,
Okay.
which allows the bacteria of all kind to thrive. So it helps, but it's not specific for that particular
Okay.
function.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Probably helps with that too.
Okay, so we'll go back to the slides then. All right, so now let's look more specifically at the food question here. So why do we need proteins? All right, so just a little refresher on what the proteins are. So there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. So this R here means that this could just be a hydrogen, or it could be a CH3, or it could be two CH3s. And in the next slide here, I show, in fact, the options that are available. So these are the 20 amino acids that form proteins. And you see they all have the same core structure of the amino group, this middle carbon, and the acid group. But on this middle carbon, you can add various combinations of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And some of these additions are quite large. You see down here in this amino acid arginine, it's got a long little chain connected to that. We call this the side chain, or the R group. And the way they differ is that some of them have a charge on it. Some of them are positively charged, some are negatively charged. Some don't have a charge, a full plus or minus, but they're partially charged. So here, for example, you see these oxygens. I've been emphasizing that they tend to hold the electrons more closely to each other. So these are partially negatively charged. And the importance of all of these charged ones is that they bind water, which is charged itself. And then we have this third category where you don't see the oxygens present, and the electrons are very evenly distributed. They have very little charge, and they don't bind water. So they tend to cluster to each other in the middle of the proteins. So these are put together by the ribosome, this protein manufacturing site in the cell. And it assembles them as a long chain of amino acids. This particular enzyme here has, as you see, 124 amino acids. And when this all folds up into a three-dimensional shape, when we talked about enzymes, I showed you this picture. This is kind of a space-filling model of an enzyme. And when we eat protein, much of what we're eating is enzymes, just the enzymes in the cow muscle or in the bean or the plant, whatever. We're eating the enzymes that are in that. And what happens is that in our stomach, which is rather acid, it causes this whole structure to kind of unravel. Then there are enzymes that chop up the amino acids, the chain, into smaller pieces until you've regenerated the original amino acids. All right. So we have to have protein because of the 20 amino acids that you find in protein. There are 9 of them that we cannot make. We do not have the enzymes to make these from simpler molecules. So those 9 are listed here, all right? And so people who are on really low protein diets, and it's very much a disease of poverty, it's pretty hard to get a really low protein diet in the United States or any first world country. Anyway, that can be a really fatal disease if you don't have enough protein in your diet. And it's primarily because you need these amino acids to make all your own enzymes. So they often mention that, especially if one way to get a mix of all the amino acids that's in the same ratio as the ones in your body is to eat something that is just like your body, which is another animal. But if you're a vegetarian, then some of the plants have different mixtures of amino acids. So for example, beans tend to be deficient in methionine. Corn, on the other hand, is deficient in lysine. But if you eat a mix of bean and corn, then one complements the deficiency of the other, and you can get a perfectly good mix of everything you need for amino acids from a vegetarian diet. And in fact, things that I've read suggest that you don't even have to be particularly fastidious about this. If you eat a lot of vegetables, one or the other, you're very unlikely to be deficient in any particular amino acid. Because in the plant, which is making 20,000 different kinds of proteins, it needs all of these 20 amino acids. These deficiencies really come about because when you're eating seeds, you're eating a bean or a corn kernel, much of the protein you're eating is a storage protein that the plant has made to feed the developing embryo in the seed. And so that tends to have a skewed ratio of some of the amino acids. Okay, so when you eat protein, you unfold the chain, your enzymes chop it up into the amino acids. Almost all of this occurs in your intestine before it gets inside the cells in your body. And what goes across the cells that line your intestine are individual amino acids or very small combinations of 2 or 3 of these. And once it gets in your body, what happens to it? Well, a lot of it just gets degraded and used for energy. So in that long cycle we saw for glucose goes into that cycle of reactions called the Krebs cycle. Many amino acids go directly into the Krebs cycle, and there they get converted to CO2. Now, we have this special problem, though, that we have to deal with this nitrogen. And conceivably, if this is just cleaved, you could end up with ammonia. And ammonia is a very toxic molecule. You don't want ammonia cleaning fluid floating around in your blood. It will kill you very quickly. Among other things, it will change the pH in your blood. And we're very kind of... Looks like all right, I've got somebody speaking in the background there. So the way we deal with this is in a metabolic pathway called the Reo cycle. We take these nitrogens and we fix them into this small molecule urea, and urea goes out in our urine. So the excess nitrogen from the protein in our diet is filtered in converted to urea, filtered in our kidneys, and then excreted in urine. Now, the other thing that happens to a lot of the protein we eat is that these amino acids basically get recycled. They go into our cells, and our ribosomes use them to make new proteins. So, a variety of routes here for proteins. Now, I want to touch on one other aspect of this kind of global cycle of nutrients here, in that, as I said, we ultimately get all of our atoms really, from plants. And it's all solar powered in the end. And the plants can get everything mostly from the air, from water and CO2 and oxygen. But there are these other molecules like nitrogen that the plant has to have to grow. And if you buy a bag of fertilizer, it'll have it on the outside there, the NPK ratio of that fertilizer. That's the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. And these are elements, basic elements. You can't synthesize them. There's just so much on the planet, and they have to be in the soil in order for the plant to grow. So kind of the big global picture here is that most of the nutrients that are in the food we eat are not returned to the fields in which those plants were grown. So we may hear that California, I've heard this said a number of times, that California grows half the food in the United States. That's not true. California grows nearly half the fruits and vegetables in the United States. But most of our food, I mentioned, is from rice, corn, wheat, soybeans. And it comes from millions of square miles of fields in the prairie lands of the US and Canada. So South Dakota, North Dakota, Michigan, etc. It's just wheat fields to the horizon. And so you have in the soil, in these wheat fields, the nitrogen from either commercial fertilizer or nitrogen fixing plants, plus phosphorus, the P, plus potassium, the K. And those limiting atoms end up in the seed in the plant. That seed then goes to make pasta and bread, and kind of, as I said, 80% of our caloric uptake, that is taken out of the soil into the seed and into our food. And when we eat that food, all of the excess, and we're of course burning most of it for energy, most of that excess goes into our municipal sewer system, and here it ends up in Neary Lagoon. If you're in Santa Cruz, and this is the Santa Cruz water treatment plant. Some of that goes out into the ocean, but most of it goes into the sludge that is produced in the treatment facility. And it's either taken up by bacteria in the treatment plant, or in the case of, say, phosphorus, they add chemicals that will precipitate, bind the phosphorus, and then it settles out into the sludge. And the sludge, a lot of it just ends up in the landfill. Years back, I know that we were using some of our sewer sludge here in Santa Cruz. It was going to feed cotton fields down in Southern California. There are generally laws against using sewer treatment waste and putting it back in the field because of the danger, although it's a slight danger, it's a real danger, that it can have viruses and things that are toxic to humans. So generally you can't use human waste and recycle it back into the fields. So this is kind of a big global food problem in a way. You have to restore these nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium levels in the soil in these hundreds of square miles of fields in order to keep our food supply coming. Otherwise, I'm sure you've heard this before, how crops just fail after 2 or 3 years, and you have to let the land lie fallow for 5 to 20 years, depending on the area, for those elements to repopulate these soils. Okay, so maybe I'm going to give you another chance. So we're actually nearing the end. This is going to be a little bit shorter lecture, but a chance to ask questions about any of that. And actually, yeah, Joanne, you actually, I suspect, know a fair amount about this problem. Any comments on it? Joanne teaches about food security, et cetera. That's why I'm asking her that.
Right. Yeah. Well, particularly in developing countries, really poor countries, where I basically lived for 30 years in Africa and Asia, where we were trying to work with the farmers who really did not have a notion or an appreciation that they could really increase their soil, that it was like a bank. And the more you took out without replenishing it, the lower your yields to feed your family. So just with simple methods of teaching them to mulch and to compost and to put it back, you have to cut an entire banana tree to get one banana head at the plant. And the whole plant, enormous plant, just to get that group of bananas, that's the end of the tree. Why not chop it up and compost it and put it back? Well, this was a foreign concept. So just gradually, by working with the farmers and getting a group together, these principles became a livelihood for growing enough food to get to sell some, to put their kids in school, etc. So everything that Barry just said is like very critical in those parts of the world where a farmer on less than 2 hectares of land is feeding about 70% of the world, because most of the world is living in Asia and Africa, if you want to look at the numbers. So, I mean, so anyway, it's vital. What we just saw is just the tip of it. And what we do in industrial countries has its corollary in the poor sections of the world.
Right, thank you. Okay, Constantine, you had a question. Oh, yeah, you gotta unmute yourself. Okay, you're not muted here. Try again.
No, I don't have a question.
Okay, here we go. Oh, you don't? Okay, I guess that was left over from last time.
Right.
All right. Anybody else have any questions about that? All right, so a question here. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Gail's been waving her hand for a long time. I wonder if you could call on her.
Oh, Gail? Okay, let's see.
He's muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So when I was in Bali and a few other places, it seems like they did use human waste to fertilize their rice fields and other things. And I was wondering, did they just maybe adjust to all those things, or are they just sicker? That was one question. And then the other one had to do with, surely with all these high-level skills we have, we ought to be able to figure out some way to purify that waste so that it could be, in fact, used to replenish the land.
All right. Well, on the answer to your first question, I mean, for millennia, people have used what's called night soil.
Yes.
Night soil is human waste, and so farmers, yes, in many parts of the world use human waste. And I think the question of whether it's a problem or not, I think the answer is probably 98% of the time no. You know, and part of it is just kind of in, you know, the U.S. versus Bali, the kind of risk assessment is driving that. And that kind of speaks to your second question, and that is, could we, with our technology, treat our waste in a way that it could be recycled? And I'm not an expert in this, but I think the answer is it's not the science, it's the cost. Although there is also fundamentally this risk thing, and it's probably a situation where we're just not willing to take much of a risk, even though it would be very small. It would make a lot of sense. It's the technology there. It's very much a political issue also. Joanne, you might have some view on that.
I was just going to mention also that even if we did find a way and we found it acceptable medically, it's a distribution problem. How are you going to get it from the city where we were talking about our sludge in Santa Cruz back to the fields? Well, we're a little bit lucky because we have Watsonville not very far away, but most urban areas are not close as we are in Santa Cruz to the farming areas. So the price in hauling that away and the environmental costs on using the fuel to haul it away might make it a really not a viable solution.
Okay.
And can I have one more question?
Sure.
Well, because I want to go back to your chart about the artificial fertilizers.
Mhm.
It looked to me in that chart like the population explosion took off as soon as the artificial fertilizers came about. And I'm wondering, did artificial fertilizer basically drive our huge overpopulation problem? And also, though, it seems strange to me because most of the population did not take off in the place where we have, lots of chemical artificial fertilizer. So I don't quite understand that.
Well, I think the fertilizer allowed for that population boost. Without that, it would have been more difficult. You would have had more widespread famine. But of course, there's also just a huge export of food. I mean, for the US, for example, we're massive food exporters. So a lot of that does get to other parts of the world, and other parts of the world do have some access to synthetic fertilizers. So it's a very complex political scene. Now, the person here, I don't know who it is, CYNDZEN has been asking a question. Who is that? Go ahead.
That's me, Cynthia.
Okay.
My question is related to what Gail asked, and I think that they're trucking the cake, as they call it, from Santa Cruz wastewater treatment plant to fields in Salinas. And I don't see why it can't be used to grow biofuels or cover crops or whatever, and just let natural processes clean it enough to be used. I was also told at Watsonville wastewater treatment plant that they have, they use enzymes to clean everything, to do the process, the biological process in the treatment plant, which is similar to septic systems or what happens in our gut. But that antibiotics, which you would think would kill off those enzymes when they reach the treatment plant, are so diluted by the time they get there that they're very minuscule in the ratio.
I think that's right. No, I think there is a fair amount of work being done on this, of trying to rescue that as a resource, because, the question of potassium phosphate, et cetera, is there enough for all the crops in the world? And the answer is there is plenty there, but there's limits to cheap phosphate and cheap potassium. Rock contains a lot of these, and so it's coming down to a risk assessment question and a cost question. But there is a lot of work being done on trying to recycle some of this material. Linda Locatelli. Linda, okay, I'm trying to
again here.
Okay.
There was a very good program on Netflix about Bill Gates. I think it was a couple hours worth, and his foundation's work, many works. And one of them was a human waste project. And they go through all the various ideas that were played with and the few that were selected, and some that were successful, and they are recycling and getting energy out of it in the process. It was quite detailed if one is interested.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the main things that, is holding up doing that such a thing is that food is still cheap. For the moment, we have the resource and we're just running through it. But at some point, we're gonna run into limitations, and that may not be so far off. Mark, did you still have a question, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that a great deal of this synthetic fertilizer is washed into deep groundwater, and a lot more of it is also lost to surface runoff and ends up in dead zones at the mouths of rivers like Mississippi on the Gulf of Mexico, where it feeds algae that ends up depriving ocean waters of oxygen. as well. So there's a good deal lost to just diffusion into the larger environment as well.
Yeah, it certainly can be and has been a big problem. You know, if people are really doing good farming practice, it's possible to put it on in the right time and the plant will just suck it up, and it can be done very efficiently. But again, in a lot of places in the world, that's still a problem. A lot of places, I just think of something like Lake Champlain or whatever in Vermont, your home state, you know, a lot of that runoff is from all the lawns, all the huge lawns all around the lake. And so people are fertilizing their grass and it rains and that phosphate and nitrogen goes into the lake and you get a bloom. Yeah, that's a problem. A question, okay, Karen, I have to unmute you. Okay, go.
Okay, I have a question about water. I heard that some farms were using fracking, water waste from fracking to fertilize some of the, or not fertilize, but to water maybe citrus, oranges in, I don't know, maybe southern areas, wherever the fruits were grown. I was just wondering if the plants would take up whatever chemicals from the fracked water or not, with the drought a while ago.
Do not know the answer to that. It would, it would depend on just what had been added. It's interesting. I could look that up, but I don't know the answer to that. Have not heard of that myself, but a real possibility. Yeah.
Okay.
Any more? No. All right, I'm going to go back to the slides here.
Get this off of here.
Finish up the last. Let me just a second here. I'm gonna mute people and go back to share. All right, so just kind of a few closing remarks here. So one of the reasons we eat food is to get energy from it. We have a kind of international problem of getting excess food and simply weighing more than we need to weigh. And so it's important to take a look at the kind of biochemistry of calories here and what makes food caloric. So we know that fat is a lot more caloric than either carbohydrate or protein. So carbohydrates and proteins are both about the same, basically about 100 calories per ounce. But fat is 2.5 times more caloric, 250 calories per an ounce of fat. And chemically, why is that so? So if you look at our major food sources here, the fats, and we have here a fatty acid with its long chain. We have the sugars, and we have proteins in the form of amino acids. So what's different about this fat molecule versus these molecules over here? And the big difference, you can really see it with the sugars especially, is look at all of these oxygens here. Every one of these carbons has an oxygen. Over here, this carbon is attached to a nitrogen, and this carbon is attached to an oxygen. And a lot of the side chains on this can have oxygen in. And that is the key difference. Because what happens when we use a molecule to get energy? And as we went through that whole long metabolic pathway, the point was that ultimately you're combining the electrons in your food with oxygen to make H2O. In sugars, a lot of the electrons are already combined with oxygen. In other words, we can think of this as partially burned over here, but the fats are just almost pure hydrocarbon. There's no oxygens in this chain, and so every one of these chemical bonds can be used as a source of energy. And that's the fundamental reason why fat has more energy than carbohydrates and proteins, because the whole process is based on combination with oxygen. And that's also already partially occurred in sugars and in amino acids. So one interesting consequence of this, kind of following up our kind of more global questions that we were talking about with fertilizer, is the fact that a lot of the potential food in the world and in the United States right now is being used to provide fuel instead of food. I got interested in this question. Whoops, we're going to come to that. Interested in this question when I heard on the radio somebody saying that if you used ethanol for automobile fuel, that the amount of ethanol needed to fill the tank of an SUV, about 20, 25 gallons, that took an amount of corn that would feed a person for a year. So you take all this corn, feed a person for a year, or you take the same amount of corn, convert it to ethanol, and fill an SUV one time. I thought, that can't be right. So I sat down and did my little back of the envelope calculations, and it is right. It is right. And it partly reflects the kind of amazing energy efficiency of our body, but also just reflects the fact that ethanol is not a very good fuel because it's already partly burned. It's already combined with oxygen. So that gasoline contains a lot of this molecule. You see, it has 8 carbons. 8 is octo. This is what octane is. It's pure hydrocarbon. It looks like the end of a fatty acid chain because it is exactly chemically equivalent to the end of a fatty acid chain. Natural gas is considered better because the ratio of hydrogens to carbon is much higher. So when you combine this with oxygen, you're going to produce fewer CO2 molecules. I'll get my cursor to move here. Then when you combine this with oxygen, because here you've only got 2 hydrogens for every carbon. This one you've got 4 hydrogens for every carbon. But when you burn ethanol, you just don't get as much energy from it because a number of these chemical bonds are not going to generate energy. They're already combined with oxygen and they're essentially unavailable as a fuel. Okay, so to kind of wrap up then and give my last chance to give you some slight nutritional advice. So one word of advice is, if you go to the IHOP, don't order this. This is for one person for breakfast: 2 pork chops, 3 eggs, and 3 pancakes. And one of the unfortunate things in our current societies is you can get this for so little money. Huge amounts of calories for very, very little dollars. And so my kind of final nutritional advice here is the following. So first of all, calories do count. That's a really important part of deciding whether or not we're going to get overweight. So avoid gigantic servings. It's become just about impossible in a restaurant to get a serving size that is not really fit for 3 people. I think Rusty and I know a lot of you from talking to that, often just buy one thing and split it and you can get more than enough food. And secondly, that the calories are often in the fat. All right. In the first lecture in this course, I brought in a Big Mac and showed that fat in the Big Mac really only contains about 35% of the total mass of the Big Mac, but it contains about 60 to 70% of the total calories. And that's largely because of the soybean oil that's in the special sauce. The second general bit of advice is that balance is the key. What should you eat? You should eat a bit of everything. And there are all of these rather complex dietary formulas and recommendations, but the one I like best is people have suggested just to look to see if there's some color on your plate. If your meal is all brown, and it's interesting, when you go into restaurants and you open the menu with pictures of it, a lot of the restaurants, especially the inexpensive restaurants, everything there is brown. There's nothing with color. This hamburger has a few little flecks of lettuce in it. But if you've got some veggies and you've got some fruits, then you've got a balance. And this is really related to the fact that it's best to eat things that are cellular, and not processed food. Oh, I'm going to turn this off. Hello? Yeah. Sorry for that interruption. Okay, so best to eat cells. And the big difference here is that if you're eating cells, you're getting 10,000 different kinds of molecules, all the micronutrients, all the fiber, all of the things that your body has evolved to deal with. But if the food is processed, you're really just eating largely starch or just concentrated forms of a few kinds of molecules. And lastly, there are no magic foods. Every 3 months, there's some new magic food that will cure whatever disease you think you might have or make you very slender while eating all of it that you want. And just as a biochemist, I can tell you that that is just not the case. All right, so we've kind of come to the end there, folks. And I'm going to come back here and allow people to ask any final questions that they have. Anybody here? Let's see, I kind of can unmute people if you have questions or want to wave your hand. All right. Nobody's objecting too strenuously to my nutritional advice. Karen.
Getting back to fats, is it better to still choose the polyunsaturates and monounsaturates over the saturated, or can we still have whole milk or dairy products like that?
Well, you may have read that in recent years, there's been a kind of rethinking about fats, thinking that they are not as bad for us as they had thought in the past. I think there's still definitely advice that unsaturated fats are better than saturated fats. It's really a quantity question. You know, fats per se, having some fat in your diet is fine and your body can deal with it. But it's just that they're so caloric that it's really easy to, you know, find yourself eating over 3,000 calories a day if you're eating food that's just has a lot of fat in it. So it's more quantity than other kind of danger issues.
Carbs and
The balances.
Okay, and Cindy?
Is there ready to be taken?
I don't think so.
Cindy, did you have a question?
Doesn't matter the order.
There's a
Yes.
person I didn't know before, CYNDZEN.
Sorry. Yes, this is Cynthia. So these artificial foods that are undigestible, what could they do to your body? Would they block your intestines when you can't digest that artificial fat or whatever it is?
Yeah, I don't really know about those, so I'm reluctant to say. There are clearly things like cellulose. Early on, I talked about this healthy noodle thing that's basically just a cellulose noodle. I think in small quantity, that's fine. It's really just fiber, but if it's really just a kind of process,
You'll refresh.
food, I would avoid them. You know, and it's an excess.
If you want a little footstool, it's right there.
Oh. Okay, Constantine.
Okay, so based on your last part of the lecture, you indicated that the fats have much more calories in them for whatever quantity than the carbohydrates. Well, as you know, the newest diet these days is the ketone one, in which you can eat you eat tons of fat so that your body gets rid of the other fat that is created by the carbohydrates. Does that make any sense? Because there are some people who are getting results that way. What's going on, do you think?
Okay, so I've read a little bit about it. The main thing is that even with the keto diet, the calories count. In other words, if you eat a lot of food of the recommended forms in the keto diet, you're still going to gain weight if you're eating a lot of food. And what I've read on the National Institutes of Health sites is that it does seem to be a little more effective than a lot of other diets on a fairly short-term, 6-month basis. But like almost all the other diet studies that have been done, you start to go out a year or more and people just regain the weight. Just in the long term, there just are not very many diets that work. And that's, it gets into rather complex physiology that we just don't understand, but our bodies get into these set points and it's really hard for us to move away from these set points.
Alcohol would fit in there.
Maybe you should address ketosis at this point.
Yes.
Both. You got the
Ketosis.
It's a small percentage, though.
Well, interestingly,
It's mostly fructose.
when that comes up in biochemistry classes, it's usually in the context of starvation. And that is because your body will use the carbohydrate sources first. It'll use available blood sugar. It'll use stored
We're losing you here.
glycogen, etc. And then when it really starts to be starved for easily available food, it'll start tapping into the lipids. And part of the byproducts of breaking these down are ketones. In fact, if you ever smelled acetone, etc., doctors can often diagnose certain kind of diabetic syndromes by your breath. You can smell the acetone-like ketones that are volatile compounds that come out in your breath. So, the basic idea of this diet is sort of sound. It's almost a kind of a induced starvation state where you're triggering the catabolism of your fats. And so that's why you kind of lose weight, but you can't eat unlimited amounts and still lose weight on that diet. The calories still count.
Then I still have a question. I lived in Italy for a long time, and my nephew had what they called acetone, which means like acetone, like an acetone breath.
Mm-hmm.
He was in the hospital, and they said kids died from it. So I presume that was ketosis.
Yeah, probably was. Yep.
But he was not starving by any means.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm just guessing here, but there was some sort of metabolic trigger there that, for whatever reason, I think some forms of diabetes, for example, you start altering the hormones that control the
I had that
sugars.
Velveeta cheese noodles. I haven't had that for a year, maybe 3 years.
Yeah.
Maybe longer than that. I never buy it. But I Adam kept talking about it, and I bought that.
Do they still make them?
Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of sometimes I'm reminiscing with people. I remember, you're telling old stories. My family was so poor, we used to buy imitation Velveeta. You can actually get it. All right. Any other questions here? Well, I think we've come to the end, folks. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have.
Yes.
And I guess I'll probably be doing this, of course, again next spring. And I certainly hope to do my molecular biology course in the fall. I get another 3 of my biologist colleagues, and I'll give a couple lectures. So that's always been in October and very likely online, but we hope to keep it going. We hope to keep all of our OLLI activities for all of you OLLI folks. It's important for us to retain this wonderful group of people in contact with each other. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry.
Barry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank